So how terrible. Okay. I almost forgot that I have to record it. All right. There we go. Okay. So now that we're recording the lecture, I am recording the lecture for you, by the way. And again, this is your introductory lecture on the definition of anatomy and physiology. Anatomy being the study of the structure of body parts, physiology being the study of the function of body parts. And sorry about that. I just began recording this. I have a YouTube channel where I'm uploading all the lectures in case you miss a lecture, and then you can go to that YouTube channel. Okay. So that, you never know if there's an emergency. You have to be here for the tests and you have to be here for the lectures. But if there is an emergency, I have it recorded, and I have it recorded for you so you could listen to it again. Okay, let's move on so it's not boring if you do listen to it again. All right, so again, we went over the subdivisions of anatomy, gross being anatomy of structures visible to the naked eye, microscopic structures too small to be seen with the naked eye, and developmental changes in those structures since birth. An interesting study that I've done in the past, and I'm not going to test you on this aspect, but it's retinoic acid. Retinoic acid is found in skin creams and in different creams we put on our body. And what I found when I did my own embryological research, this is 25 years ago, that retinoic acid adversely affects the development of the frog embryo. And in high concentrations of the retinoic acid, the frog embryo axis was reversed. In other words, the head was in the butt position and the butt was in the head position. It was a monstrosity. And you might say that this animal study helped to save pregnant women from adverse effects from using it on their own bodies while they're pregnant. So this is an example of an animal study in developmental anatomy that I did that was useful to society. So I always hearken back to my own research in my descriptions of what A&P principles are about. Now, clinical applications of anatomy are observation, manipulation, palpation, and auscultation. What do I mean by that? Well, it's all fine and dandy to know the definition of anatomy, that it's the study of structures, but how does that manifest in the medical setting? First of all, you've got to be able to observe your patient, make them walk backwards, see if they can grasp, look at their reflexes. Observation is a very important first step in coming up with a diagnosis, seeing the health of the person. You can't always talk it through because some patients either aren't able to understand their symptoms, are not capable of understanding their symptoms, or cannot even communicate. So observation, very important first method. Manipulation, movement. You move a shoulder, you move a hip, you move the leg back and forth to see if the hip is doing all right. Manipulation. Our own labs have observation through, now, of course, this is a 2D situation, the articulation labs, which are the joint labs, looking at how bones fit together. Muscle labs, I've got your muscle labs. GetBodySmart.com gives you a little bit of a 3D, 2D approach, but I've got the pictures in the lab manual. So those are your muscle labs. Palpation means feeling with the hands. Feeling one's breasts can tell you if there's a mass or swelling or abnormality, right? These are simple, easy to do processes. Palpation is feeling body parts to see if there's any abnormalities. Auscultation means listening with the stethoscope. Auscultation, you listen in different parts of the chest for example, a leaky valve, which is known as a murmur. Swishling sounds like that. I'm terrible with detecting leaky valves. You have to really listen very carefully for auscultation of leaky valves. But that's another example of how anatomy is used in the medical setting, okay? Observation, manipulation, palpation, and auscultation. Again, let me reiterate that physiology is the study of the function of body parts, while anatomy is the study of the structure of body parts. So what something does is its physiology. And there's no doubt that there's chemistry, math, physics that underlie what physiology is. I think physiology is a much more interesting part of this course. And I always hate a course that teaches just anatomy separately than physiology. So boring. Together, they complement each other very well, so you understand the true nature of our interdisciplinary approach to anatomy and physiology, which is that anatomy fits the physiology and understanding how a body part works and functions. We call that the principle of complementarity. The function or physiology of a body part always depends on its structure or its anatomy. So for example, your head is kind of round in order to kind of prevent pressures, grabbing pressures on it. Your hair, pull your hair a little bit. Your hair is a strand. It's on your head to prevent sun damage, for example, and to keep you warm. So that's its function, its physiology. What's its anatomy? It's a strand. And why is it a strand? We think about the anatomy fitting the physiology. In other words, why is something structured the way it is? That's complementarity. That's the principle of complementarity, that the anatomy makes sense and it fits with the physiology or the body functioning. We say that the bones are very hard, for example, because the anatomy has mineral deposits that are hard enough to protect what's underneath. We say that hard anatomy, for example, the skull bones of your head, is strong so that the delicate inside of the brain is protected. If you look at your vertebrae, feel your backbone. There's a strong set of bones, hardy they are, very hard, protecting the spinal column. Spinal column's very delicate. Break it, it can never recover many times. And so there's also layers known as meninges inside of the bones. And there's also, and those are protective layers, protective and nourishing layers. And there's also liquids, meningeal fluid that protect the spinal nerves. So that's an example of how some bones anatomically, some structures around the spinal cord and the brain protect. The anatomy protects, and that's the physiology. The anatomy is structured in such a way that it protects. Let's do another example, the lungs. Have you ever thought, why don't you choke to death? You have a ton of water in your lungs, right? You can't have lungs that are brittle, that don't allow movement across. Well, it's an interesting point. Let's take a look at letter B. The lungs exchange gases because the anatomy of the alveoli, the air sac, alveoli is a fancy word for air sac. The anatomy of the alveoli affects its physiology. So the alveolus is one cell layer thick and it is bathed in fluid so that air, oxygen, and carbon dioxide can travel across that area. If we spread the lungs out, they're about 40 square feet. And it's big. You have a big area that you can spread out. Well, what does that mean? How does that fit with complementarity? The alveolus is a single layer thick and very delicate and bathed in fluid so that air can be exchanged easily. That's the anatomy. The physiology is that air is exchanged easily. The question is, why don't you drown in the liquid of your lung? And it happens to be because of something known as surfactant. surfactant. I'm not going to test you on that right now. That's an ANP2 term. But surfactant is a chemical that keeps the water molecules apart, preventing you from choking to death. And lung cells, we happen to call them type 2 alveolar lung cells, produce it to prevent you from choking to death. So what am I trying to get at here? My whole point the take-home message is that complementarity means that the anatomy fits the physiology. The anatomy of the bones protect what's underneath. The anatomy of the lungs allow you not to choke to death, but exchange gases to help you to live. And all of this complementarity is based on 3 types of forces placed upon anatomical parts. Keep in mind, we are constantly being hit by forces. Every time we move, everything we do, forces are placed upon us. I alluded to the fact that our head is round to prevent what we call torque forces. Torque forces are circular forces. Draw a little circle next to the word torque. Go like that, a little circle and an arrow, because those are torque forces. Anything round in your body resists torque forces. Compressive, what I want you to do, and I like a demonstration of compressive forces. Hold on. Compressive forces are forces that push. And so I have a paper. This is an old paper I wrote back in 1988. Anyway, nothing to do during the coronavirus, but look at your old papers, everybody. You'll be looking at this 30 years from now. All right. So compressive forces are forces that push. And let me see if you can see me. Wait a minute. Let me get my... All right. I'm going to push down on the paper. Oh, look, there it goes. You see? There it goes. The paper buckles. Compressive forces are, draw 2 arrows together like that. 2 arrows together next to compressive forces. Compressive forces are those forces that push together on each other. Now, torque forces are twisting forces, so like that. And then tensile forces are pulling forces. You pull, you pull. So pull your hair, it resists tensile forces. Pull a piece of paper, that's tensile forces. Tensile forces are very good for cords and hairs, all right? You are able to resist tensile forces very well when you are a rope or a strand, all right? If you take a piece of paper and you pull it hard enough, it takes a long time for it. Let me get a piece of paper. Hold on. I need a pen. Sorry about that, everybody. So what I want to show you is, trying to do demos here, but I didn't want to rip my 1988 paper, right? You wouldn't want me to do that. This is a piece of paper. I can pull, takes a long time. Tensile forces, there's a lot of strands of paper in the piece of paper, and they really resist pulling quite a bit. Then I push it, like I really have to pull a lot. Oh, finally. If I push it, it falls right apart, right? If I twist it, it just rips apart with torque. So what am I getting at? Why am I spending time on a demonstration about forces? Because forces are constantly placed on anatomical structures. I took a whole course in anatomical structure, called it biological materials, and those forces can be very destructive for anatomical structures. And your anatomy fits very well to resist those particular forces placed upon them. So your hair, for example, is resisted by, right, tensile forces. Someone pulls your hair, it's a very good resistor. Your bones are half as strong as steel in resisting compressive forces and as strong as steel girders in resisting tensile forces. For example, no matter how chubby a person is, they're not going to buckle. Their femur is not going to buckle, all right? Compressive force, very strong resistance. So your bones are well adapted for this. So anyway, when we take a look at our structures. And, you know, if you go to chapter 11, I have organized the chapter to go over our topics, complementarity, and all the different structures. There's a little story in the beginning of every chapter. And well, this one is chapter 11, not chapter 1. It's a story of a starfish that's saved by a girl. And it always has a little bit of a social aspect to the story, where she saves the starfish. And, you know, it's supposed to be an inspirational story to start off the class. Okay, so please do read the read the ebook and send me your codes. By the way, I've only gotten 2 or 3 people that sent me their codes, so I can give you the extra credit, the 3 points, the code for the textbook. I want to make sure you're reading that. Very important. But anyway, we start with the case of a saved star, and there's a little checkup section that discusses how the different body parts work together in the starfish, and then we kind of apply it to the human body. And if you look on page 385, figure 11.2, this shows you the organization that you see on the screen right now, how we have levels of structural organization of the body. So again, I'm referring to figure 11.2 in the textbook. That's how I'm going to be referring everyone. You should have your textbook with you, you know, open up to the chapters so that you can refer to the diagrams as we go through, okay? But the levels of structural organization are as follows. We're all made up of atoms. We know that there's 92 naturally occurring atoms in our body, and 96% of all life is made up of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Those atoms organize to form molecules. In fact, there are 4 macromolecules in our body: proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. All right, those make us up. Lipids are fats. We're going to talk more about these 4 molecules in the next class. Carbs are instant energy. Lipids are fats. Proteins give us structure. Nucleic acids are our genetic material. Molecules organize into organelles, which we said are little organs inside of cells. And then, of course, we have 200 different types of cells in our body, roughly 200 different types, which all organize into groups of cells, making a similar function, carrying out a similar function, having a similar structure. And muscle, epithelial, nerve, and connective are the 4 types of tissues. Organs are formed when a group of tissues work together. So, for example, the kidney has a covering, epithelial tissue has nerves going to it, right, nervous tissue has connective, a lot of protective and nourishing type tissue. There's even muscle to every organ, even the kidney. You have a little bit of muscle in there to get things moving. So all organs have all four of the types of tissues in them. And then they form organ systems. If you look, I will refer to page, scratch out 6 to 7. Page 6 and 7, I've moved the organ systems to page 412 to 413. Figure 11.23. Okay, so this should be figure 11.23. We've got the different systems of the body, the 12 different systems of the body: muscular, skeletal, lymphatic, respiratory, digestive, cardiovascular. Organ systems. Organ systems are groups of organs performing a similar function. And together, all those 12 organ systems make up the organism, okay? Again, figure 11.23 of your text. Page 412 to 413. So that's our structure, our hierarchy of organization. This section I want to just skip over. I don't think it's very important for us to go over this at this point, but I'll briefly state these are the different life functions that we have: movement, response, metabolism, excretion, reproduction, maintaining boundaries. All of us humans have these functions. All of our cells have the functions. So while I am going to not test you on this, I just want you to close your eyes and get a big picture of the fact that we carry out all these functions, and every one of our little tiny cells carry out those functions as well, okay? And then all of our cells and us have three major survival needs, all right? And life is fragile. Without nutrients, oxygen, or water, you'll die very quickly. Let's start with, I suppose, food. We've got to eat. You get up, you're like, all right, must have food. At some point, you get hungry. Lipids give you your high energy. Carbs give you your easy access, instant energy. And proteins, you know, like your hair, gives you the structure, builds your structure. You eat some eggs, you have protein, it builds structure. I want to say that these nutrients are going to be addressed in the next class in detail. All right, we're going to go over all the macromolecules for the organic chemistry part of the course. All right. Oxygen. You can't have life after 3 or 4 minutes without oxygen. All right. Most people don't know this. Hold on to your seats. The reason we breathe, take a deep breath. The reason we even have oxygen in our body is for one and only one reason. It releases energy from food. You can't survive without it. That's why we breathe. We say that oxygen is the final electron acceptor for cellular respiration. And without that, you cannot derive energy from your food. And therefore, cells survive between 3 and 4 minutes without oxygen and then die. The reason is they are not deriving the energy from food. You could say our spirit, our soul, our lifeblood, our whatever it is that makes us alive is due to energy. And when that oxygen does not allow continued release of that energy from food, that's when we die. So that's the reason for oxygen. We're going to deal with that in A&P too. We're going to talk about cell respiration in much more detail, okay? Water. We are 60 to 80% body weight water. All chemical reactions occur in water. I know that I mentioned the lung to you, that it is bathed in water. Why don't you drown? I told you about the surfactant. We discussed that that's complementarity, right? That anatomy of the lung fits the physiology. Must have water, must have oxygen, must have nutrients. That is the 3 basic survival needs. And what does this do? All of this encompasses homeostasis, the maintaining of a stable internal condition, a stable state, and that is homeostasis. Your body must always maintain a stable state. The failure to maintain a stable homeostatic state is known as disease. You know, write that down, put a star next to the word disease. That is our end to every lecture. You know, you might say, that template, it's always depressing, always ends up with disease. Well, that's the truth. That's pretty much medicine. First, you got to study out about how it works, maintaining stable homeostasis, and then you got to study the imbalance of homeostasis, which is disease. Let's give an example. The nervous and endocrine system, nerves being, right, your little network that gets you to move, think, endocrine being your hormones, those two work together, those two organ systems work together to maintain a steady state, to maintain homeostasis. Those are your 2 most important organ systems for homeostasis. But every one of the 12 organ systems maintains homeostasis. And when those narrow limits are not maintained, we say that that's diseased. Failure or imbalance of homeostasis equals disease. I have this here, stimulus, receptor, control center, effector. These 4 terms represent the general components of how we maintain homeostasis. So why don't I just give you a couple of examples, all right? Negative feedback and positive feedback. Body temperature, pH of different parts of the body, like the stomach, all are examples of homeostasis. And most homeostasis is maintained by something known as negative feedback mechanisms, all right? All based on a stimulus being picked up by a receptor monitoring your environment, sent to the control center, usually your brain, and then the brain sends a message to your effector, which is either a muscle or a gland, to respond to the original stimulus. So let's talk about the stimulus being temperature. You know, you're sitting in a room, it's getting hot, not allowed to go out, right? Whatever. It's getting hot. Mom won't put on the air condition. Your receptor, we call it thermoreceptors, monitor the environment and pick up the temperature change. All right, let's do the home thermostat as the hypothalamus, as your control center. The hypothalamus, take your brain and go to a little bit bottom part of it, is the hypothalamus, a little knob that sits on top of your pituitary gland. And you don't know what the pituitary gland is yet. It's a little pea-sized knob at the bottom of your brain. Anyway, hypothalamus is right on top of it, and it is your home thermostat. All right, temperature change, let's say it gets chilly. Receptor on the skin has a little protein that picks up how cold things are and how warm things are, sends a message to the control center, the hypothalamus, and the response is that, well, very simple. You're going to start sweating. And hormones also react to increase your metabolism, decrease heat loss, and you begin to sweat and you lose heat. Okay. Whoops. That's temperature regulation. And in the text, I have a picture of temperature regulation. If you refer to figure 11.6, basically, it's a person feeling someone's head. And then we have figure 11.7, blood glucose regulation. So if you go to page 391, it shows how blood sugar is regulated. And on page 391, right, here's page 391. So take a look. Figure 11.7, we've got sugar regulation. Sugar is basically maintained at roughly 90 milligrams per milliliter in the blood. Insulin is a hormone that's released when blood sugar level goes too high. So you eat a donut, right? Your receptors detect that donut, and insulin is produced by the pancreas to attach to cells. So make believe my hand is a cell. The insulin attaches to the receptor on the cell, and the insulin hormone tells the cell to suck up sugar, take sugar in. That is what insulin does. Insulin is the hormone made by the pancreas in the diagram to cause your body cells to take up sugar. And that therefore lowers blood sugar levels. That is called negative feedback. Negative feedback is when the response counters the effects of the stimulus. In other words, the reaction, lowering blood sugar, is the opposite of the stimulus, which is the raising of blood sugar. You ate the donut, right? You ate a donut. That's the stimulus. You had a donut. The sugar level went up. Well, what's the response? Sugar level must come down. What goes up must come down. Draw an arrow up next to negative feedback, right here, and draw an arrow down. One arrow up, one arrow down tells you how this operates. What goes up must come down. That's for your body temperature. If you get too hot, body temperature must come down and you sweat. If you get too cold, body temperature must go up and you start to shiver, right? That is maintaining homeostasis through negative feedback. Blood glucose regulation is the same thing, negative feedback. You eat a ho-ho, right? That's a little donut. They're tasty little treats. Your sugar level goes up. Insulin is produced by the pancreas, making your cells suck up sugar and get it out of the bloodstream and make your sugar level go down, your blood sugar level go down. The opposite happens again. If you look at figure 11.7, we've got the response by the pancreas. When there's not enough sugar, you have not had your ho-hos for the day, I'm kind of joking with the ho-hos, by the way. But anyway, when you do not have enough sugar in your bloodstream, the pancreas alternatively makes something called, what's the hormone in there? Figure 11.7, glucagon. Glucagon causes the liver to release stored sugar. Sugar is stored in the liver as glycogen, and the liver chops up the glycogen when glucagon, the hormone, stimulates it. And the liver releases that sugar into the bloodstream and increases the blood sugar level, right? What goes up must come down. What goes down must come up. And that is negative feedback. If we look further onto figure 11.9 and 11.8, these are pictures of what we call positive feedback. Positive feedback is defined as a mechanism when the response to the original stimulus enhances the original stimulus. So right next to this positive feedback mechanism, right here, right, arrow up, arrow up. So put two arrows up. So in other words, the response enhances the original stimulus. All right, that's positive feedback. Positive feedback is a relatively infrequent event. It doesn't happen that often, in other words, because things get out of control and the body wants it to get out of control. Now that seems crazy. Why don't we go to part 2? Do not laugh at my picture right here. It's a baby. The baby's head is down, by the way, for all of those who were breech babies. You're supposed to come out head first, not feet first. Does not make sense. Feet make sense, but anyway. There's a uterus, there's a vaginal opening, there is the cervix, and there is the vagina. When the baby's head hits the, grows big enough, right? You're at the end of your period of gestation or babe development inside of the uterus. The head of the fetus becomes large enough that it starts hitting the cervix. The cervix has receptors for pressure, right? You see that? Receptors for pressure. The receptors for pressure send messages to the brain to release a chemical known as oxytocin, all right? The oxytocin causes more uterine contractions, which is going to do what? Make the baby's head keep hitting the cervix. The cervix keeps sending messages to the brain. Therefore, more oxytocin is released. Whoa, things are out of control. Enough contractions happen due to the oxytocin hormone being released from the brain, due to the baby's head hitting the cervix, that the baby goes out, right? These are examples. Positive feedback this is an example of an infrequent event. You're not pregnant constantly. You're not giving birth every day. An infrequent event that leads to homeostasis, the removal of the baby from the body to bring things back to normal. So I kind of think of it as kind of out of control situations that get even more out of control in order to get everything back to normal. So you got to get that baby out. That cervix gives has receptors for pressure and causes a lot more contractions when the baby stimulates it. Let's look at blood clotting. I have a picture of this 11.8 of the text. And if you look, basically, when you are cut, platelets recognize the cut. What are platelets, Demppley? Platelets are little chips of cells in the blood that recognize ripped areas of blood vessels, let's just say, rough areas, and have clotting factors in them. So platelets are chips of cells that have clotting factors in them. Clotting factors make clots. Clots, as you can see from the picture, are stops of blood from leaking. All right, and we got to keep this very simple. When you have a cut, platelets in your bloodstream will attach to the cut, and the more jagged the cut, the more platelets can attach. Okay, and platelets attract more and more platelets by sending out chemicals. That's positive feedback. The original platelet, the stimulus, sends out more platelets, and here's a little picture of more platelets to come to the area to clot the blood. And that's your positive feedback mechanism. Again, infrequent event, not very often. And basically more and more platelets come to the area to form the clot, and the clot brings your body back to normal. You're not bleeding to death. So those are positive feedback mechanisms. Last but not least, anatomy has to involve medical imaging. Some of you may go into the medical imaging field, and I don't think that's a bad idea if you're not interested in nursing or phys ed or PT. You can go to the medical imaging field. It's a fascinating area. Medical images prevented exploratory surgery. Back in the 1930s, X-rays were developed. X-rays visualize dense structures, so that on the X-ray, the dense structure appears lighter. So if you look at a liver and there's a dense round part, that's a liver tumor or whatever it may be, an abscess, a collection of fluids, but often a liver tumor. So X-rays are old technology. They're like 80, 90 years old. They're cheap. What is it, $100 for an X-ray? They're fast. They're not too dangerous. You don't want too many X-rays, but an X-ray can visualize bony structures and tumors, but they're very broad. They visualize water on the lungs, for example. So X-rays visualize dense structures, and the dense structures appear lighter in the X-ray. Right? And we'll go over more X-ray images as we go on in the bone part of our course. But X-rays are, while cheap, don't give you a very good 3D view. So CAT scans are known as CT scans, computerized axial tomography scans, use multiple X-ray sections, boom, 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 hundreds to thousands of them to image a particular area. All right, so if you want a CT scan, that's going to be your best. You can put a thumbs up next to it. That's your best image. It eliminated exploratory surgery. You have a spot that's really, you want to see really closely, you can visualize it best through a CT scan or CAT scan. The words are used interchangeably, CT and CAT scan. Let's skip to letter D, ultrasound. Ultrasound, I think, is a better option than a CAT scan for a lot of cases, because an ultrasound sends out high frequency sound waves to give echoes back and form images. Okay, it was developed during World War II with submarines, trying to find out the submarines, sending out echoes to determine where the sub is. It's low penetration. It's no good for bones, but it's very good to get a 3D image. Ultrasound is used obviously neonatally, right? Prenatally, to look at the developing embryo and fetus, all right? That's a good technology because it does not really hurt the baby. It does not hurt tissues, whereas CT scan is using radiation. X-rays and CT scans are using radiation and should not be used ever near a developing fetus or embryo. Very important for their little bodies to not be exposed to radiation. And ultrasound, I want to say, is not hurt. It sends out low penetrating sound waves and gives images back. That's the way in which ultrasound is done. They kind of put a warm cream on you and send out the sound waves. The cream enhances the sound wave. I want to say that you don't want to do too many ultrasounds of babies. It still aggravates them. Every time, I have 3 kids, every time they did sound waves on, the ultrasound, the babies would get worked up. The fetus would get worked up. So I can't say that it has no effect, but certainly not chemical, physical damage like the X-ray and the CAT scan. But anyway, that's the ultrasound. If you have a choice, everyone, tell your parents, tell yourself, do the ultrasound versus the CAT scan, because the CAT scan gives way more radiation, like 1,000 times more radiation than a flight across the country. You fly across the country, it's equal to an X-ray. Did you know that? From New York to California, one flight equal to an X-ray amount of radiation. You try to limit your radiation in life. There's radiation all the time, background radiation we call it, but you try to limit it in life. And a CAT scan gives you a ton of it. They even correlate one CAT scan equal to X amount of increase in cancer rate. So I don't want to take CAT scans lightly. I often don't like that they just throw a CAT scan out when they want to see something when they could have done an ultrasound. CAT scans are also much more expensive. So like if you have a kidney stone, maybe you should get an ultrasound instead of a CAT scan to see if you have a kidney stone. So try always to get the lesser test that has radiation. DSA, let's go to this one. DSA is digital subtraction angiography. This uses radioactive dyes to detect blockages in particular areas. And, it will tell, for example, a blockage in an artery. It shows the flow of blood, for example, from one part of the body to another. That's DSA. And last but not least is the MRI. MRIs map the water molecules in a tissue, maps the hydrogens in particular, the spin of the magnetic waves of the water molecules, and gives a nice image. MRI gives a pretty good image, not as good as a CAT scan, but does not do hard substances. That's more for X-rays and CT scans. So they map the soft tissues of the body. So if you want to look at, for example, the discs, the soft discs in between your vertebrae, you would take a look at it through an MRI very often. And it depends, if you really want a very clear image, you can need a CAT scan. If you want to see these images, please look at page figure 11.4 on page 388. Gives an ultrasound, gives an X-ray, gives a CT scan, and an MRI. So it shows some images. I particularly like the first one, the MRI of the brain, showing shows the hypothalamus in there that we talked about. But that's a nice little picture of the brain. Again, figure 11.4. I'm not putting them up on the lecture notes. I want you to refer to your textbook while we go through these images, okay? Detracts from the lecture. Last but not least, the body cavities and their membranes. There are a variety of body cavities, and we can demonstrate. Basically, I'm going to stand here, see it, and I'll just kind of show you. If your head and your spinal column are your dorsal body cavity, everything else in front of you, right, is your ventral body cavity. Your thoracic, which is your chest, and your abdominopelvic cavity underneath your chest is part of the ventral body cavity. Your cranial, or your head, which holds the brain, is your vertebral cavity. And, if it holds your brain, it's your cranial cavity. If it holds your spinal cord, it's your vertebral cavity, okay? And the abdominopelvic obviously is broken up in an abdominal and a pelvic. The abdominal, meaning the viscera. Viscera is a fancy word for the organs of your abdomen: stomach, liver, spleen, gallbladder. Those are all your viscera. So if you say I have a visceral response, that means your organs are literally responding. So that's your abdominal cavity, and your pelvic is all your privates, right? Your rectum, your reproductive organs, your bladder, that's your pelvic. The cranial cavity, again, holds the brain. Vertebral holds the spinal cord. Abdominal pelvic holds the viscera and the privates. And then we move on to our thoracic. Take a deep breath, breathe in and out. Part of your thoracic cavity is your pleural cavities. Pleurosis is a disease of the lungs and inflammation, and pleural cavities contain the lungs. Your mediastinum is everything else in your chest. Your heart is part of your mediastinum, and it's surrounded by a pericardial cavity. And your superior mediastinum, I always call that Indiana, because there's a lot of roads in Indiana, nothing but roads. And the superior mediastinum is nothing but tubes. The esophagus, which is your food tube, go like this, that's your superior mediastinum. And your trachea, which is your windpipe, are all part of the superior mediastinum. last but not least, and I always try to keep the lecture to 1 hour, then we can take questions afterwards, okay? Last but not least are your smaller body cavities. And your smaller body cavities, you know, touch your mouth, that's your oral body cavity. Oral surgery, surgery of the mouth. Your oral body cavity is your mouth and your alimentary canal, oral and digestive. Some say that we're a tube within a tube. We have our mouth and we have the whole tube going from mouth to anus. The nasal cavity, touch your nose, that's all of the different sinuses and little canals in your nose. Touch your eye, that's your orbital cavity, your eye socket has your eye. Touch your ears, that's your otic cavity. Has balance, fluid properties. You know, your balance comes from your ear. There's fluid in there to maintain your balance, and obviously your hearing. That's your middle ear cavities, otic. And then something no one ever remembers, and that's your synovial cavity. Move your arm, move your neck. Those are your little joints in between the bones. They have lubrication for movement. That's your synovial cavities. And we're going to address those cavities when we do the bones at another point, okay? Let's open up for questions. I'll open the chat room and we will begin. All right, let's unmute everybody. Put everyone on the screen and let's talk. All right, that's the lecture. Let me now just stop recording this.